Welcome back to Earthly Delights, where we dig a little deeper and uncover what your garden is really trying to tell you. Today we're talking about one of the simplest things in your kitchen and one of the most misunderstood in the garden: rice. Now, if you love houseplants, tend a backyard bed, grow herbs in containers, or you're the kind of gardener always looking for practical, low-waste ways to build healthier soil, you've probably heard the claims already. A handful of rice in the soil, a splash of cloudy rice water, more worms, richer earth, faster growth. It sounds natural, affordable, and almost too good to ignore. And honestly, I understand why so many people want to believe it. When you care about your plants, when you're trying to revive tired potting mix, improve a small garden, or make better use of what you already have at home, these shortcuts feel exciting. But here's the truth. When rice goes into the soil, the story is a lot more complex than most viral tips make it sound. Used the wrong way, rice can work against the very life you're trying to support. Used with understanding, though, it can reveal something far more powerful: how the hidden world beneath your feet actually works. In this video, we're going to move past the hype, look at what soil science really says, and explore how to work with your soil instead of guessing at it. So if you love learning what truly helps plants thrive, make sure to subscribe to Earthly Delights. And let's dig into what rice is really doing in your garden. Part 1. The viral myth versus the hidden reality. So let's begin with the claim that sounds harmless, even hopeful: that scattering rice into your soil works like a gentle, slow-release fertilizer, feeding your plants over time. It's an idea many gardeners want to believe because it fits something deeply human in us: the desire to waste less, reuse what we already have, and turn simple kitchen scraps into something life-giving. But once we look beneath the surface, soil science tells a very different story. When rice enters the soil, your plant is not the first one lining up to use it. The first to respond is the soil microbiome, that enormous hidden community of bacteria and fungi already living around your roots. And to them, rice is not a balanced meal for plants. It is a sudden pulse of starch, almost pure stored energy. That matters because starch is rich in carbon, and carbon is fuel for microbes in the same way sugar is fuel for us. The moment rice lands in the soil, it's like ringing a dinner bell underground. Dormant microbes wake up, active populations expand, and the whole biological engine of the soil begins to accelerate. But that surge of activity comes with a cost, because all that carbon cannot be processed on carbon alone. The microbes need nitrogen too. And that is exactly where this garden shortcut begins to turn into a much more complicated equation. Part 2. The secret life of soil and the C to N ratio. If you've ever walked through a forest and noticed how fallen leaves quietly disappear into dark, sweet-smelling humus without anyone lifting a finger, you've already seen this principle at work. What makes that transformation possible is balance, especially the balance between carbon and nitrogen, what soil science calls the C to N ratio. Microorganisms don't just eat anything in any proportion. To grow and function well, they need a fairly specific diet. Their own bodies tend to fall around a carbon to nitrogen ratio of roughly 8 to 1 to 10 to 1. And the food source they process most efficiently is often close to 24 to 1. Rice, however, is nowhere near that balance. It brings in plenty of carbon, but very little nitrogen. So when you bury too much rice, microbes rush toward that energy source and then quickly face a shortage. To keep digesting all that starch, they begin pulling inorganic nitrogen, forms like nitrate and ammonium, out of the surrounding soil. In other words, they take the nitrogen your plants were depending on. This is known as nitrogen immobilization. And while the microbial world may be thriving in that moment, your plants can start showing the strain. Leaves may yellow, stems may weaken, growth may slow down, and the whole garden can look as though it has simply lost its momentum. Yes, that nitrogen will eventually cycle back after those microbes die and decompose. But before that happens, your plants may spend days or even weeks under real nutritional stress. And that raises an important question for any thoughtful gardener. When we rush to boost life above the soil, are we sometimes disrupting the life below it first? Pro 3. Cooked versus raw rice. What do microbes really crave? And once you understand that rice is really feeding the soil life first, the next question becomes obvious. If you're going to use it at all, what form actually works best? Hard, raw grains that break down slowly, or soft, cooked rice that microbes can reach right away? From a soil biology perspective, cooked rice has a clear advantage. When rice is cooked, the starch granules absorb water, swell, and go through a process called gelatinization. In plain terms, the structure opens up and becomes far easier for microbes to digest. That makes cooked rice the closest thing to fast food for the microbial world. And when it's used carefully, the response can be remarkable. One of the first groups to move in is saprophytic fungi, the decomposers that specialize in breaking down dead organic matter and turning it into something the soil can use. Within just a few days, often 4 to 7, you may begin to notice delicate white threads spreading through the area. That's mycelium, and it's one of the clearest signs that decomposition is active and healthy. As that little pocket of soil comes alive, it becomes warmer, richer, and more biologically active. Signals move through the moisture in the soil, and earthworms respond with surprising accuracy. They are drawn to this zone of decomposition, and once they arrive, they begin tunneling, loosening the soil, and leaving behind castings that are among the most complete natural amendments a gardener can ask for. Raw rice can eventually support a similar process, but it moves more slowly because the starch remains locked in a tighter, crystalline form. So while both cooked and raw rice can play a role, cooked rice is what delivers that faster biological spark. Part 4. The fatal mistake, when good intentions turn anaerobic. But this is exactly the point where enthusiasm can outrun wisdom, because this is where many viral gardening tips leave out the most important detail of all. Quantity matters. If too much rice is added too quickly, the microbial population doesn't just increase, it surges. And as that underground feeding frenzy intensifies, those microbes begin consuming oxygen faster than fresh oxygen can move through the soil. What was once open, breathable ground can suddenly shift into an anaerobic state, meaning the soil becomes oxygen-starved. Once that happens, the balance changes completely. Beneficial decomposition gives way to the wrong kind of bacterial activity, and instead of a fresh, earthy smell, the soil can begin producing sour, harsh odors. Alcohols, acids, and ammonia-like compounds that stress roots and can even damage them. At that point, you're no longer creating an inviting zone for worms and healthy fungi. You're creating conditions they actively avoid. And the warning signs are not subtle. If the soil starts smelling sour, rotten, or sharply ammoniacal, that's your signal that the system has tipped too far. The safer approach is much more restrained. Use only a small amount, roughly a small handful, or about 50 grams per square meter. Mix it with a bit of finished compost and bury it a few inches down. Let the compost help buffer and guide the process. The simplest way to think about it is this. Soil biology responds best to a gentle nudge, not a heavy shove. You don't build a fire by smothering a spark under a log. You build it with small, steady fuel. And in gardening, patience is often what separates real regeneration from unintended damage. Part 5. Rice water. Not a fertilizer, but a prebiotic. Now let's shift from the grain itself to the cloudy liquid many of us pour away without a second thought. Rice water. If you've ever rinsed rice before cooking and paused over that milky bowl, wondering whether you were throwing away something useful, you're not alone. Rice water has earned a reputation online as a kind of miracle tonic, something people talk about as if it were a complete fertilizer hiding in plain sight. But the truth is more subtle, and in some ways more interesting. Yes, rice washing water does contain small traces of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, along with minor amounts of vitamins such as B2 and E. But the levels are low, far too low to treat it as a true substitute for a balanced fertilizer program. Its real value lies somewhere else entirely. Rice water is far more useful as a prebiotic for the soil than as direct plant food. The suspended starches and sugars in that cloudy liquid become a quick source of energy for beneficial microbes, especially fungi that help build a healthier soil environment around the roots. Some research has even shown that rice water can support the growth of beneficial fungi like Metarhizium anaerobic, which plays a role in natural biological control against pests such as aphids, thrips, and root weevils. So when you apply rice water thoughtfully, you're not simply feeding the plant. You're encouraging a living protective system around it. And that's such an important shift in perspective, because in the garden, some of the most meaningful support happens indirectly. Not by forcing growth from above, but by strengthening the unseen relationships below. Part 6. The Alchemist's Secret: Fermenting Rice Water. Labs. And if you really want to take rice water beyond the basics, this is where things become truly fascinating. Because at a certain point, you're no longer just reusing a kitchen byproduct, you're culturing life. This is the world of lactic acid bacteria serum, or LABS, one of the foundational preparations in Korean natural farming. Instead of using fresh rice water right away, you begin by saving it in a jar and letting it sit quietly in the shade for a few days. During that time, wild microbes from the surrounding air begin to colonize it, and the scent starts to shift into something gently sour. That's your sign the microbial conversation has begun. From there, you combine 1 part of that fermented rice wash with 10 parts milk. And the reason milk matters is beautifully simple. The lactose helps create conditions where lactic acid bacteria can thrive, while many less desirable microbes fall away. After about a week, the mixture separates. A thick curd rises to the top, and a pale yellow liquid settles underneath. That liquid is the part you want. Properly diluted, about 1 part serum to 1,000 parts non-chlorinated water, it becomes an incredibly useful tool in the garden. It can accelerate composting, help break organic matter down faster, and create conditions that naturally suppress some fungal problems. What you're doing, in the most literal sense, is brewing a living biological helper in a jar. And there's something deeply meaningful in that process, because it reminds us that the strongest transformations in the garden rarely happen in haste. They happen slowly, quietly, and often out of sight. Part 7. Rice hulls, the unsung heroes of soil structure. But our story with rice doesn't end with the grain or the water. To really understand its value in the garden, we also have to look at the part most people overlook completely: the husk. Rice hulls may not look impressive at first glance, but in terms of soil structure, they are one of the most practical and sustainable amendments a gardener can use. For many years, growers have relied on materials like perlite to improve drainage and aeration in potting mixes. And while perlite does help create airspace, it comes from mined volcanic material. Peat moss, another common ingredient, carries its own environmental costs through the destruction of fragile bog ecosystems. Rice hulls offer a different path. They are an agricultural byproduct produced in enormous quantities, and instead of becoming waste, they can be put back into the cycle of growing. Because they are so light, rice hulls help open up compact soil and create the air pockets roots desperately need, especially in dense or heavy ground. They also strike a beautiful balance with water, holding enough moisture to help during dry spells, while still allowing excess water to move through when conditions turn wet. And because they contain high levels of lignin, they break down gradually rather than disappearing all at once, which means they can support soil structure over the course of a full growing season before slowly returning their organic matter back to the earth. So when you add rice hulls to your soil, you're doing more than improving texture. You're participating in a more thoughtful, more regenerative kind of gardening, one that turns agricultural leftovers into long-term value. Part 8. The power of silica, armor for your plants. And the real beauty of rice hulls is that their contribution doesn't stop at drainage, aeration, and structure. Hidden inside them is another gift, one that works almost like a form of natural reinforcement for the plants themselves. That gift is silica. Rice is sometimes described in plant science as a silicon accumulator, and for good reason. As the plant grows, it absorbs silicic acid from the soil and deposits it into its tissues. By the time the husk forms, that outer layer can contain a surprisingly high concentration of silica. So when rice hulls are returned to the garden, they slowly release that resource back into the soil system. And that matters because silica plays a remarkable supporting role in plant strength. It helps reinforce cell walls, which means sturdier stems, better resistance to bending and breakage, and less risk of lodging. That frustrating moment when a heavy, fruiting plant collapses under its own weight or falls in strong wind. Silicon can also help leaves maintain a more upright posture, which improves light capture and can even support more efficient photosynthesis. On top of that, it creates a tougher physical surface that makes it harder for chewing insects to damage plant tissue. So in a very real sense, adding rice hulls doesn't just improve the soil around your plants. It helps equip the plants themselves to stand stronger in the face of stress, weather, and pressure from pests. Conclusion: the philosophy of the soil. So what have we really uncovered here today on Earthly Delights? We've seen that tossing raw rice directly into the garden without understanding the biology behind it can trigger nitrogen shortages and stress the very plants we're trying to help. We've seen that a small, careful use of cooked rice can wake up a rich underground world of fungi and earthworms. We've learned that rice water is not some miracle fertilizer, but it can still play a meaningful role as a microbial booster. And we've discovered that rice hulls, so often discarded, can improve soil structure and slowly return silica to the garden as a source of strength. But beneath all of those practical lessons is a bigger one. Good gardening is not about forcing results with shortcuts, hype, or heavy-handed tricks. It's about understanding relationships. Healthy growth above the ground begins with healthy life below it. And when we stop obsessing over feeding the plant directly and start supporting the living system that surrounds its roots, the garden begins to respond in a much deeper and more lasting way. I think that's why soil teaches us more than just how to grow vegetables or flowers. It teaches humility. It teaches patience. It reminds us that the most important work is often invisible at first. Roots, fungi, bacteria, quiet decomposition, slow transformation. The strongest gardens, just like the strongest lives, are built from the unseen foundation upward. If this changed the way you think about what's happening beneath your feet, subscribe to Earthly Delights, like this video, and share it with someone who loves learning how nature really works. And tell me in the comments, which kitchen scrap are you most curious to try in your garden next? Until next time, keep your hands in the soil, keep your curiosity alive, and keep finding wonder in the earthly delights all around you. See you in the garden.